When Deborah Miller walked into Judge Judy's courtroom, she wasn't just a disgruntled parent. She was a woman on a mission to destroy the reputation of the teacher she blamed for her son's academic shortcomings. Deborah had spent months preparing for this moment. In her mind, she was the ultimate protective mother, a woman fighting against a broken educational system that had failed to recognize her son's extraordinary potential. She arrived equipped with a massive stack of folders, a wardrobe designed to convey suburban elegance and moral superiority, and a lawyer who had been instructed to emphasize the emotional distress her child had suffered. She was convinced that the school board and the specific teacher, Mr. W.W. Henderson, would buckle under the pressure of a public, televised lawsuit. But Deborah had committed the most common, fatal error in Judge Judy's courtroom. She completely underestimated the woman behind the bench. Before Deborah had even finished her opening statement, Judge Judy had already waded through the actual evidence. She had the school's academic records, the transcripts of private parent-teacher conferences, and the devastating logs of the students' behavior in the classroom. What the security cameras and the internal reports showed was a far cry from the victim narrative Deborah had been feeding to the local news stations. The footage and the documents told a story of a boy who was not being stifled, but who was consistently disruptive, refusing to complete assignments, and bullying his peers. The receipts weren't just for school supplies, but for the countless gifts Deborah had tried to bribe Mr. Henderson with to inflate her son's grades. Judge Judy sat there, eyes narrowed, watching the performance unfold with the skepticism that had become her trademark. She saw right through the fake tears and the indignant gasps. Deborah believed she had created the perfect victim story, but the truth was about to turn her multi-million-dollar lawsuit into the most spectacular public humiliation of her life. The room was tense, the cameras were rolling, and Deborah was about to learn that in this courtroom, the law doesn't care about your ego. Mr. Henderson was a man of integrity, a veteran teacher who had guided thousands of students through the complexities of high school algebra. He understood that every child had different needs, and he prided himself on his patience. But Tyler Miller was different. Tyler wasn't just struggling with math. He was actively sabotaging the learning environment for every other student in that room. He was the kid who threw paper airplanes during tests, the student who openly mocked others, and the one who claimed that the entire curriculum was below his intellect. Yet, in Deborah Miller's version of reality, her son was a misunderstood prodigy, being held back by a bitter, incompetent teacher. The lawsuit didn't start with a bang. It started with a whisper, a series of passive-aggressive emails that soon escalated into demands that would make any reasonable person shudder. Deborah's emails were a masterclass in entitlement. She demanded that Mr. Henderson provide private, one-on-one tutoring for Tyler during his own lunch break. When Mr. Henderson politely explained that he had other responsibilities and that Tyler's grades were a direct result of missed homework assignments, Deborah didn't see an educator doing his job. She saw an enemy of her son's destiny. She began CCing the principal, the superintendent, and even local school board members on every trivial complaint. It was a classic case of a parent trying to weaponize bureaucracy to force a favorable outcome. But Mr. Henderson held his ground, documenting every incident, every missed assignment, and every disruption with the precision of a seasoned veteran. He was building a file that Deborah thought she could bury, but she was only laying the groundwork for her own downfall. When she finally filed the lawsuit, claiming that the hostile environment created by Henderson had stunted her son's development, she didn't realize that she was effectively dragging herself into the sunlight, where her behavior would be exposed for exactly what it was, a desperate, narcissistic attempt to manufacture a tragedy where none existed. The day of the trial finally arrived. The courtroom was packed to the gills. Reporters, curious parents, and even some of Tyler's former classmates were there, sensing that this wouldn't be a run-of-the-mill small claims case. Deborah Miller entered, draped in an outfit she clearly thought screamed grieving mother, complete with somber colors and a veil-like accessory that felt performative rather than mourning. She clutched a leather-bound notebook as if it contained the secret scrolls of her son's intellectual genius. Her lawyer, a man who clearly smelled a paycheck rather than a solid legal argument, strutted in with the confidence of someone who hadn't bothered to double-check his client's email trail. As proceedings began, Judge Judy took her seat. She didn't offer the pleasantries you'd find in lesser courts. She was here for business, and she wanted the truth, not a drama production. Deborah's lawyer stood up, clear-throated, and began an opening statement that painted Mr. Henderson, as a prehistoric dinosaur of the education system, a man who allegedly targeted Tyler because he was threatened by the boy's unparalleled cognitive abilities. He spoke of systemic bias, emotional scarring, and irreparable damage to the child's future. It was a speech meant to pull at heartstrings, but it did nothing but pull at Judge Judy's nerves. She watched him over her glasses, that signature sharp stare cutting through the lawyer's theatrics. She wasn't nodding. She was counting the seconds until he stopped talking. Deborah, seated at the plaintiff's table, took her cue. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a tissue, letting out a soft, well-timed sniffle that felt as rehearsed as a high school play. She looked around the courtroom, expecting to see sympathetic faces, but all she met were the cold, judging stares of people who had heard rumors about her behavior in the PTA. Deborah didn't notice the atmosphere shifting. She was too busy living in her own delusion. She believed she had already won, that the emotional weight of her performance would be enough to force a payout from the school district. Little did she know, Judge Judy wasn't looking at the mother. She was looking at the evidence that was about to destroy the entire case. The stage was set, the trap was laid, and the curtain was about to rise on the most humiliating 20 minutes of Deborah Miller's life. "Mrs. Miller," Judge Judy said, her voice cutting through the stuffy air of the courtroom like a razor. She didn't look at the lawyer. She looked right at Deborah. "You claim that Mr. Henderson has a vendetta against your son because he's too intelligent for the public school system. That is a heavy accusation. Do you have any proof of this vendetta, or are you just here to waste my time and the court's resources?" Deborah blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the lack of sympathy. She leaned forward, clutching her tissues tighter. "Your Honor, it's not just a claim. Tyler is a gifted student. He was reading at a college level by the 4th grade. Mr. Henderson simply couldn't handle a child who corrected his algebra on the chalkboard. It was intimidation, plain and simple." Judge Judy didn't blink. She reached into the file on her desk, the one she had been studying before the cameras even started rolling. Intimidation? Let's look at the logs, shall we? According to this, on October 14th, Tyler wasn't correcting algebra. He was allegedly throwing a chair across the room because he didn't want to take a quiz. On November 3rd, he was caught sending inappropriate messages about the teacher to other students during class. Are these the actions of a misunderstood genius, or the actions of a spoiled child who has never been told no in his life? Deborah's face flushed a deep, indignant red. That report is fabricated. Mr. Henderson has been out to get him from day one. He's just trying to cover his own incompetence." "Mrs. Miller," the judge interrupted, her voice rising just enough to command the room's total silence. "Don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining. I don't care what you think about Mr. Henderson's teaching style. I care about the truth. And the truth is, you've spent more time trying to bully the school administration than you have spent making sure your son actually shows up to class on time." The courtroom was deadly silent. Even the lawyer, who had been so confident moments ago, started shuffling his papers, suddenly aware that the wind had been taken out of his sails. Deborah opened her mouth to protest, but Judy wasn't done. She picked up a stack of emails, the ones Deborah had sent to the principal, and tossed them lightly onto the desk. "I've read your emails, ma'am. They are not the emails of a concerned parent. They are the emails of a neighborhood bully who thinks she can buy respect. Let's see what Mr. Henderson has to say." "Let's look at the math, Mrs. Miller," Judge Judy barked, not looking up from the documents. "You claim your son is a genius, yet here are his test scores, F, D, C. These are not the grades of a misunderstood prodigy. These are the grades of a child who doesn't do the work. You want to talk about failure? The only person failing here is the one who raised a child to think he is above the rules." Deborah gasped, opening her mouth to speak, but the judge held up a hand, silencing her instantly. "I'm not finished. I've read the correspondence between you and Mr. Henderson. You didn't write to discuss curriculum or advanced placement. You wrote to demand that he ignore the school's policy on late assignments because, and I quote, Tyler shouldn't be penalized for his creative process." The gallery let out a collective chuckle. Deborah looked like she'd been slapped. She stood up, her composure cracking. "That's taken out of context. Mr. Henderson was trying to crush his spirit. He hates Tyler because Tyler sees the world differently." "Mr. Henderson doesn't hate your son, Mrs. Miller," Judge Judy retorted, her voice dropping to that icy, dangerous volume that signaled the end of the line. "Mr. Henderson is an educator. He has a duty to teach. not to bow down to parents who think their children are gods. And while we're talking about spirit, let's talk about these gifts. The judge gestured to a series of receipts clipped to a statement. You bought Mr. Henderson a $200 gift card to a steakhouse. Why? A teacher doesn't need a steak dinner to teach algebra. You were trying to buy his silence, and when that didn't work, you decided to sue him to save your own face. The courtroom erupted into a buzz of whispers. The lawyer sitting next to Deborah looked as if he wanted to slide under the table, realizing he was the face of a sinking ship. Deborah's face was pale now, the performative tears replaced by a genuine, frantic look of realization. She was losing control, and she knew it. The narrative wasn't just crumbling, it was being burned to the ground. Judge Judy wasn't just deciding a case, she was conducting an autopsy on Deborah Miller's ego. And the worst part for Deborah? She was the one who had handed the judge the scalpel. Mr. Henderson took the stand, his posture steady, and his voice calm. He didn't look like the tyrannical villain Deborah had described in her opening statement. He looked like a tired man who had spent 3 decades trying to make a difference in children's lives. Judge Judy didn't waste a single breath. Mr. Henderson, let's get right to the point. Mrs. Miller claims you stunted her son's academic growth. She says you were intimidated by his genius. What do you have to say about that? Henderson looked at Deborah, then back at the judge. Your Honor, I've taught thousands of children. I love teaching. Tyler is a bright boy, but he lacks the one thing required for academic success: discipline. I offered him extra help 3 times a week after school. I sent extra practice materials home. His mother rejected every single one of them. She told me in an email that Tyler didn't need extra help because he was already beyond my teaching level. The courtroom erupted again, and this time, even the bailiff had to stifle a smirk. Judge Judy leaned forward, her face a mask of controlled fury. So, let me get this straight, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low register. You offered this woman extra help, she refused it, and then she turned around and sued you because her son is failing? That's not a vendetta, that's a delusion. She turned to Deborah. Mrs. Miller, you've been painting this man as a monster, but the evidence shows he was the only one in that school trying to give your son a chance. Are you telling me that your son's geniuses is so vast that even basic algebra is beneath him, yet he can't manage to turn in a single assignment on time? Deborah stood up, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. He wasn't failing because he didn't know the material. He was failing because the material was boring, and Mr. Henderson refused to engage him. You're just like the rest of them, Judge. You're biased against parents who actually care about their children's future. The room gasped at her audacity. Calling Judge Judy biased was like throwing a match into a powder keg. Judy didn't yell. She didn't have to. She just stared, her silence louder than any shouting match could ever be. She knew exactly what she was dealing with. An entitled parent who would rather burn down a school and ruin a man's career than admit her child was just average. The trap was about to snap shut. Mr. Henderson, Judge Judy said, turning her attention back to the teacher with a look of stern expectation. You mentioned that Tyler often claimed his work was above the curriculum. Do you have an example of this so-called genius's level of work? Henderson nodded and produced a thin, folder-clipped document from his briefcase. Your Honor, this is his final project on polynomial equations, which was the core of our curriculum for that semester. He submitted a blank sheet of paper with the words, "I don't do busy work," scrawled across it in thick black marker. He didn't even attempt the first question. The courtroom erupted into a mix of gasps and stifled laughter. Even the bailiff had to look down at his shoes to hide a smirk. Deborah's face went from pale to a bright, defensive red. He didn't mean it like that. He was protesting the lack of creative freedom in your classroom. He was challenging the system. Judge Judy wasn't buying it for a second. She picked up the paper with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated, stared at it for a long, silent moment, and then fixed her gaze on Deborah. Mrs. Miller, do you know what this is? This isn't a protest. This isn't a challenge. This is the absolute definition of laziness disguised as intellect. It is an insult to every child in that classroom who sat down, did their work, and respected their teacher. She tossed the paper onto the stand Wendry. I have grandchildren, Mrs. Miller, and I know exactly what a bright child looks like. A bright child asks questions. A bright child seeks out challenges. A bright child doesn't use their parents to excuse their lack of effort. Your son isn't a genius, Deborah. He is a child who has been relentlessly enabled by a mother who values her own ego more than she values his education. Deborah was trembling now, not with the fake sadness she'd started the day with, but with pure, unadulterated rage. She realized the tide had completely turned. The audience wasn't laughing with her. They were laughing at her. The lawyer, sensing the judge's inevitable verdict, had stopped defending his client entirely. He sat back, closing his folder, effectively washing his hands of the disaster. Deborah had expected to leave with a massive settlement and a reputation for being the mama bear who stood up to the establishment. Instead, she was being unmasked as the woman who had terrorized a hard-working teacher to hide the fact that she was raising a brat. The final blow was coming, and everyone in that room could feel the air shifting. The performance was over. The truth, as it always does in this courtroom, had stripped away every layer of her lie. Case dismissed, Judge Judy declared, her voice final, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. And let the record show that this frivolous lawsuit has been rejected with prejudice. She leaned back, her expression one of utter disdain as she looked at Deborah. You didn't come here for justice, Mrs. Miller. You came here to punish a teacher for doing his job, and in the process, you've done nothing but destroy your own credibility. You're ordered to pay all legal fees incurred by the school district, totaling $28,000, and I am personally referring this matter to the State Education Board to review your conduct as a parent. Deborah didn't move. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking older, smaller, and defeated. The silence in the room was absolute. Her lawyer, who had been leaning into the case, now looked like he was trying to become invisible. The genius son, who had been sitting in the back row, hung his head, clearly humiliated by his mother's theatrics. The aftermath was swift and brutal. By the time Deborah walked out of the courthouse, her phone was already blowing up with notifications. The news of her defeat had spread across town in minutes, and her reputation as the suburban queen was in tatters. The school board meetings that followed were just as unforgiving. She wasn't just removed from the PTA, she was effectively shunned by the very community she had tried to rule through fear and intimidation. The hostile environment she had invented existed only in her own mind until she walked into court and created it for real. Her son, Tyler, didn't miraculously become a genius overnight, nor did he magically start respecting his teachers, but the protection he had been hiding behind his mother's relentless, arrogant interference was gone. He was forced to face the reality of his own actions for the first time, without an enabler to blame for his failures. As for Mr. Henderson, he returned to his classroom the next morning, not as a villain, but as a man who had survived a storm. Justice, in the end, didn't care about Deborah's ego, her money, or her connections. It cared about the facts. And those facts proved that while power might buy you a lawyer, it can never buy you the truth. Character is what remains when power fails, and Deborah Miller found that out the hard way. Next time you see someone trying to abuse their privilege to hide their own failures, remember this case. Justice doesn't care who you think you are. It only cares about what you have done.